Hello, Right Hive Conference. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host for this panel, Nicholas W. Fuller. I'm a writer, I'm a gamer. I'm honored to be moderating the panel Experimenting with Sci Fi, a Genre Masterclass as part of Right Hive 2023. I'm joined today by five extraordinary writers. Let me introduce them to you. First is Evan Mylonas, writing as E.A. Mylonas. E.A. Mylonas is the writer of the speculative fiction novel The Hush. His short stories have appeared in Clarkesworld, Fusion Fragment, and OnSpec, and I don't think I need to tell you guys that, that's kind of impressive. Hailing from Athens, Greece, he has spent the last couple of decades traveling and working through the world. In that time, he's tended to wounded wooden would be very different. Wounded loggerhead turtles, baked bread for Michelin star restaurant, and written dialogue for video games, which is pretty darn cool. A marine biologist by training, he is an advocate for the climate cause, sustainable living, and anti-corporatism, which inspire his unique brand of literary sci-fi. He currently resides outside Copenhagen, Denmark, next to a forest. He spends his time running trails, hiking paths, and climbing rocks. Hey, Evan, how you doing?
Doing fantastic. Really nice to be here together with a bunch of really great authors.
Thank you. All right, next, A.P. Hawkins. A.P. Hawkins is a biologist turned speculative fiction author and editor based in Houston, Texas. She first discovered her love of writing at a young age when she spent weekends filling spiral-bound notebooks with Lord of the Rings fan fiction. Sadly, none of it's online because I think I'd like to read that, but that's okay. Her short fiction has appeared in analog science fiction and fact and several small press anthologies, including The Librarian from Air and Nothingness Press, which sounds pretty cool. I'm actually not familiar with those ones, but I'm gonna have to check them out. AP is a co-host of Writers Lunch, an online discussion group where topics range from the finer points of world building to favorite pulp sci-fi covers, another thing I'm gonna have to check out of AP's. She's also a co-founder of Tomeworks, an editing collective dedicated to helping genre authors build better books. When she's not writing or editing, AP enjoys gaming, crafting, and spending time outdoors. She dabbles in cosplay, hand embroidery, baking, and painting minifigures for tabletop role-playing games. Amazing. AP, you're my kind of nerd.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nicholas. Yeah, it's great to be here. I promise you don't want to read the Lord of the Rings fan fiction. Very good.
All right, Alechia Dow. Alechia Dow is a former pastry chef, librarian, author of young adult sci-fi fantasies, The Sound of Stars, a Junior Library Guild selection, and How Clement ALA notable. Am I saying How Clement? All right. The Kindred Indie Next Kids January 2022 pick, A Song of Salvation, several short story anthology pieces and middle grade stories, Just a Pinch of Magic and The Cookie Crumbles, which she co-authored with Tracy. Oh, I'm not even going to try pronouncing Tracy's last name. Sorry. When not writing, you can find her having epic dance parties with her daughter, baking, reading, taking teeny adventures, and exploring her local food scene. First of all, I love the titles of your middle grade books. That's fantastic. And I love me a good dance party with my daughter too. So I'm on board. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And so many incredible authors. Thank you.
Absolutely. Tim Baughman Jr. is an author, a blogger, and freelance editor. They have a book of short stories published, and their debut novel, Kotov Syndrome, was the 2021 Queer Indie Awards winner for Best Dystopian Novel. Their works focus on the topics of mental health, sexuality, love, and relationships told through the lens of varying genres. They're an avid fan of turn-based RPGs, flavored coffee, and ice hockey. I mean, who doesn't love a good coffee? You may also have seen Tim in last year's conference or as a panelist or moderator in other panels in this year's conference. Tim, thanks for being here.
Good, whatever time it is you're watching this, and evening to the folks here recording.
And Jonathan Kincade is a philosopher, teacher, and author whose stories on the strange, fantastic, and dreadful appear in Anathema, Spec from the Margins, Faya magazine of Black speculative fiction, and Clarkesworld. He holds a PhD in English from UCLA with a focus on narrative philosophy and is a graduate of Clarion West 2022. Jonathan, should I call you doctor?
If you prefer, you don't have to. We're not in class. It's good to be here. It's my first Right Hive panel. As others have said, there are so many cool and awesome authors here. it's hard not to fawn. And so many gamers. I'm a gamer too. I'm sad that I didn't mention that. I love gaming too. I love RPGs. I also love turn-based RPGs. So I'm in good
Love
company.
it. Oh, yes, yes. This is my people. I'm so happy. It's Dr. Kincade from here on out. Anyway, this panel is a masterclass on writing sci-fi. I believe science fiction has a magic to it. In it, you can do anything you can with other genres. You want romance? Throw it in. Want dragons? Why not? But science fiction is the only genre that imagines the future. Sci-fi can be hopeful and aspirational like Star Trek and inspire generations of engineers. It can be dystopian like Terminator and perhaps serve as a cautionary tale. Or sci-fi can be absurd and funny, but still remind us about the importance of the really hard questions in any setting, like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's what I love about sci-fi. Any genre can tell a story, but only sci-fi can imagine the future. But let me ask you panelists, and I'm going to start with you, Alechia. Why is sci-fi the genre you write in, and what is the benefit of writing in sci-fi setting over, say, fantasy or general fiction?
So I guess that's a great question, but the answer is like complicated because I think I went to the library for the first time, and the first thing I found that I really related to was X-Men comics. And that just kind of opened the world for me, and I thought that's the coolest thing ever, and it gave me a lot to think about. It's not just that it was an alternate kind of future, it was that it was smart and it reflected what we were going through, and it reflected our history as well. And since then, I've kind of used that as my tool to just tell stories that I was very interested in, but also reflecting on what our world looks like, even if I'm not on our world. So it's been really enjoyable to do that. And I've been so inspired by so much sci-fi that's come out over the years. And it's just an honor to write in this genre. And I think I love it. I love fantasy too, but I love sci-fi because you can really go deep with it.
Love that answer. Love that. And totally agree. I like that you said too, that like, tell us about our world, even if you're not on it. Well put. Like, absolutely. Evan, I think like you kind of were thinking along some of these same lines when we were talking a little bit before the panel, kind of how sci-fi gives you an opportunity to talk about the things that we're dealing with, right?
Oh yeah. I started a very long journey in sci-fi back when I was probably 8. I got my hands on Jules Verne. I think it was Mystery Island, and that was the first time my mind got blown because of literature. Because I was reading through the book. It's an absolutely amazing book, and then Captain Nemo shows up at the end. So my 8-year-old mind just went. I thought, can you actually do that? Can you have characters from other books in there? So that was the first example of the concept that obviously this is not really true, but that was the first time that I understood that sci-fi doesn't really care that much about rule to begin with. And then I got older. My grandmother got me War of the Worlds, and that was the second time my mind got blown because I thought we actually lose on this one. We're not supposed to lose. We're the good guys. We don't lose. So you can do that too. And I started getting some pretty lowbrow sci-fi in my 20s, and at some point, I got a hold of Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale, and that was the third time that my mind got blown because it became apparent to me that not only could you do sci-fi well, but you could also say something extremely important and very subversive. And I think that was when my relationship with sci-fi got serious. That was when I proposed to sci-fi, and she said yes. And I have been writing sci-fi ever since. Not hard sci-fi. I completely respect anybody who likes hard sci-fi. Not really my cup of tea. But I'm more interested in, as you said, I'm more interested in the possibilities. I'm more interested in taking the rule book and throwing it out of the window as hard as you can. And basically, you want romance, you can do that. You can throw it in sci-fi. You want dragons, you can do that. You want to completely subvert late stage capitalism, I'm going to read that. I'm gonna read that.
Nice.
So yeah. I don't think that after getting hooked on sci-fi, I don't think anything else really scratched the itch in the same way, because in the end of the day, you did have a lot of great literary authors working with sci-fi, right? Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin, and anybody who had something very important to say.
Well said. Well said. Tim, what makes sci-fi? Did you propose to sci-fi also?
Well, so no, originally I would argue, having seen bios and knowing about our folks, I am probably the least traditional sci-fi author here, just in the sense that I didn't start out wanting to be a writer in the slightest. I wanted to be a musician, and then I wanted to be Stuart Scott and work for ESPN, and all these different things that had absolutely nothing to do with writing. And writing really only came about originally as a therapy exercise for me. And then, I realized, oh, well, I'm better at processing stuff when I tell it as fiction. And then somebody's like, oh, this is good, you should try yada, yada, yada. And here I am, and I'm on this panel, and don't know how I ended up here with these credentials. But the sci-fi has always been, to me, something that I find that's kind of novel as a concept. I've read a lot of different genres because I never considered myself a reader. I read what my teachers in school asked me to read, pretty much, what I had to, and it was fine. But the only things that I found myself wanting to reread tended to be speculative fiction, sci-fi, dystopia, not even necessarily explicitly something that had political or societal commentary, but things that really probed at the edges of what is possible, be that in a good way or a bad way. I think one of the quotes that every sci-fi author, if not has used themselves, is, or they've at least heard, is that one of Clarke's three laws: any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. And I think that that's a very fundamental thing for science fiction. The one that's always stuck with me, though, is actually a different corollary of that same set, the second law. And that's the only way of discovering the limits of what's possible is to venture a little way past into the impossible. And I think that it's difficult for a lot of genres to do that while still taking themselves seriously. And I think sci-fi can do that well because, if you think about it, you go back and you read H.G. Wells, you read George Orwell, you read, people from the 1800s, people from the 1980s. Just the existence of the technologies that they dealt with then is so vastly different from ours. Never mind societal changes, scientific changes, whatever it may be. That, whereas romance and interpersonal communication, there is still very much that element of humanity that exists as a thread throughout it. Science fiction now looks vastly different than it did 15, 20, 100 years ago. And I think that's fascinating. I can't wait for my books to be read one day and people look at them like, why was this world like this? This is dumb. Why can't you communicate? That is fascinating to me. The concept of me being obsolete as a writer is just okay, that's really cool. So
Fair. Yeah, true. I agree with you. It's interesting to read works that aren't that old and there's no concept of something like the internet in them, how things have changed. Dr. Jonathan Kincade, you want to tell us why you like writing sci-fi, and perhaps also what for you makes for a really excellent sci-fi story?
Yeah, sure. I actually didn't start off as a sci-fi writer. I started off writing really boring lit fic stories about kind of Hemingway-esque, this is a Civil War story about death, super boring stuff. That's not to brag on literary fiction. I love literary fiction, or even to imply that there's a hard distinction with sci-fi. There's plenty of as Evan pointed out, plenty of fantastic literary science fiction. But I started to find it kind of limiting, to just kind of write within the confines of history. You know, I'm a typical case and of somebody who's very fortunate to be living their dream as a writer. I was writing as a kid, and I would write like little comics, imitating, you know, my favorite science fiction stories at the time, because my mom was an avid science fiction reader, and so she kind of indoctrinated me pretty young. And I grew up on like Kurt Vonnegut books, which were some of my earliest science fiction books, and that was sort of my gateway to sci-fi. You know, and I just like that it enables you to deal with some, for me, it's the weirdness. I like dealing with really weird concepts and really weird ideas. And science fiction to me is always the genre that is just so excellent at doing that. Because being a person is weird, our universe is weird. Right? There's a lot of, you know, you think about like even like scientific concepts like quantum entanglement, like, you know, it's weird, right? It's strange, right? Even in the sort of experience of it. And so I think, you know, a good sci-fi story, for me, is probably weird, but it deals with, I think, as some others have pointed out, some really big concepts. I like big concepts. So, you know, I would encourage people to like not be afraid of dealing with really big ideas or big concepts. Some really awesome science fiction does that. And I would also say that it has something to say. You know, I think it's important for science fiction to sort of be a kind of a weird mirror, right? Like it's a sort of portrait of the future that also, I think, has something to say about our present moment. And so ideally something that like readers will be able to take away and reflect on, relative to, you know, what we might be experiencing or what might have already happened. So I think those are some of the things for me that are really what make a good sci-fi story. Action doesn't hurt. And I will say that, you know, for me, action is not the same as violence. I think there's super awesome action scenes that aren't sort of delving into violence. And romance also doesn't hurt because, as you said already, Nicholas, you can sort of do so much with sci-fi. And so, you know, I think the last thing I'll say is that, like, for me, sci-fi is a sort of like a tool more than I would say that I don't necessarily think of myself specifically as a sci-fi writer, as sci-fi is a space that I work in that I find really welcoming and helpful to think about really big concepts and weird ideas.
Love that. Love I like how you were talking about how it's an interesting mirror and it could talk about the future, but also talk about the current. And I know it's television, but I think obviously like you can't have that idea and not think of the original Star Trek, which really kind of pushed some boundaries in the time, and it was so aspirational for what like could be, right? It was this great future of exploring, not dystopian, horrible deathscape, you know? Like, nice. All right, AP. So what do you got? Why do you write sci-fi? What makes for a really excellent sci-fi story? Tell us everything.
Oh, well, it's interesting that you mentioned Star Trek right before you got to me, because I think that's really what kind of started my love of the genre. My dad was a really big Star Trek fan, and so I have like all these memories as a kid of like sitting down and watching not just Star Trek, but like also Star Wars with him. And that was kind of like our thing that we did together. And so I think that's what really first sparked my interest in the sci-fi genre was Star Trek. But like others have said, it's always been kind of the genre that I like to read. I read a lot of X-Men comics growing up also. And you know, things like that. Anne McCaffrey, which is kind of like it's sci-fi, but it's also kind of a blending, you know, of sci-fi with a little bit of like fantasy elements. And so I really like kind of the malleability of the genre. There are so many different things that you can do with science fiction. And we've talked about, imagining future technologies, which is all really fun. The thing for me that I really like about science fiction stories is exploring kind of what it means to be human, and like what kind of common threads are there in our humanity that help us relate to not only other people but other non-human species that we might encounter in a sci-fi universe. And so how can we as authors develop empathy with creatures that aren't human, and how can we make readers develop that kind of empathy as well? So what are these kind of common threads of like emotion or common experience that kind of bind us as sentient beings, right?
I love what you said, AP. I love it. You said that it's sci-fi can be a great way to kind of explore what makes us human, and all of our heads nodded. All of us were yes, yes, yes. So I'd love to kind of continue that idea. So I recently read The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, and she did a great job of doing that and was exploring what it means to be human and kind of with aliens. It was great. There was and this is a masterclass about writing. That would be my example, but I'm going to leave it to you, panelists. So we'll start with you, AP, because it was your thing. So I'd love to hear kind of an example of where that's done well, something that you can kind of think of and be like, they did an excellent job of talking about what it is to be human in this work. And it may not have even been a human that they were talking about,
Yeah, I think so. I think Evan mentioned Ursula Le Guin earlier. She's one of my very favorite authors, and I think she does an excellent job with this in her work, particularly in The Left Hand of Darkness, where you have more human. You have so in this universe that she's built, you have human descendants encountering each other again after a long separation, and so there's been divergence of evolution among these different pockets of humanity that all initially came from the same place. And so these are people who are encountering other people who aren't really like them anymore, not only in terms of culture but also in terms of biology. And so the whole series is about discovering these what similarities do they still have, and how can they overcome their differences and work together to establish a better society. So yeah, that's one of my favorite examples. I'm always going to bring up Ursula Le Guin when I talk about sci-fi. So
that's a good example to bring up. And you mentioned something very, you brought up one specific word, which is biology. Right, and I think Le Guin used to work as a biologist. I think so. Anyway, correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah,
I think I've heard that as well. So.
Yeah, and that informs a lot of what she's doing. And let's not forget that science fiction normally evokes spaceships, black holes, supernovas, ray guns, or well, that's the old-fashioned version of sci-fi, right? But as we're moving further and further into other areas, there's a lot more biology seeping into science fiction. I'm obviously going to be saying this because my background is in marine biology, so I do have a minor crush on Jeff Vandermeer, for example, who just fungi everywhere, aliens, and weird space-time anomalies, and weird aliens that come out of forests, etc., etc. So, but that's kind of reflective of our world as well, right? Because when we're talking about spaceships and aliens and ray guns, it's probably more reflective of the 60s and the 70s. And then things got really bad in terms of the environment, for example, and in terms of civil rights. And I would say that people got more aware of those issues that were more internal, more esoteric, as opposed to looking out towards the stars.
Well, I think that's why you see the sort of sociological focus of a lot of Le Guin's works, right? Where, she has short stories where they're sort of about the alien species that are from the left hand of darkness, but they're just sort of like on a spaceship going to a place, and it's about all of the social problems that they have with one another because they have different cultures and raising your hand in one person's culture is offensive in another person's culture, and they're sort of trying to navigate this tiny ship that they're trapped on, like Earth, this tiny place we're trapped on, and figure out like how do we get along with one another when we have different cultural dynamics and different expectations and different rules and mores and things like that. And I think that that's one of the things that I've always really appreciated about Ursula Le Guin's works.
It's not very far removed from reality. I mean, you go to India and you offer your left hand and shaking somebody's left hand, that's going to be taken as an insult. Well, not as an insult, but it is a cultural faux pas. It's this ability to reflect what's happening around us, taking that, internalizing it, and just ruminating over it. There is this wonderful line in, I always get the title wrong. The word for world is forest. There is exactly one decent human being in the entire book. And one of the aliens having a discussion with that human saying, why are not all humans like you? Are you an aberration? Are you an anomaly? And that person says, well, actually, I'm just a normal human, just like the sergeant, the villain of the story is a normal human, just like there's a huge spectrum of behaviors and attitudes. And Ursula Le Guin did point out that we're all humans, if they're good, bad, whatever, we're all human. And that was a pretty short book, but that was still a book that I think about from time to time, especially when you see things. Very recent things happen on TV shootings. I'm not really going to go into the details. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. Those are normal people. Those are not fantasy monsters. They're not demons. They're just people like you and I. And it just starts making you think, what separates me from them? AP, to your point, what makes us human, right? And I'm guessing that you're a huge fan of Philip K. Dick as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Love that. Alechia, yeah, please jump in.
I am also a huge fan of Philip K. Dick. And I've written YA sci-fi. All of them are with aliens in it, and all of them are exploring what humanity is and what bridges we can make between us and them. And I love that. I love that a lot. And I was very interested in Philip K. Dick. I never watched any of the movies that were made from the books because I was too, like when those were coming out, I was younger. And so I found the books before the movies. And I was very interested in that and what it means to be a human. And then when I read X-Men, I was like, what does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be bad? What's morality? And who decides that? And I found that really, really fascinating. So when I'm looking at books now and I'm interrogating what they're about and what kind of message they're giving me. And I'm thinking about right now, I read Laura Beth Johnson's Goddess in the Machine, which is also YA sci-fi with, I think, Razor Bill. And that was incredible. Just the amount of world building that went into this was superb. Like changing the dialect to reflect an entirely different race of people that were humans, but are now something different because of the future and, thousands of years have passed, was just, I didn't know we could do that. Like, I know that we can do it, but I just didn't see how. I didn't see my way through it without having to really bog myself down with details. But Laura Beth Johnson did it in such a clever way that really made me go, wow. Another one was Bethany St. Morrow, who wrote Mem, which is speculative, literary speculative, and it came out in the last few years. And that's just, it's very small, but it's so big as well. It's like a strange thing to say. It's the concept of if you could freeze your memories and make them into a person and then keep them locked up in a vault. And then either you can leave them there or you can take them out and like reform with yourself. It's so clever. And you just think, how did she do that? And I'm always inspired by Bethany C. Morrow, because I think she also did like social speculative recently, Cherish Farah. And it's just very, very clever. And I have always kind of stuck to the more, I stay near commercial and I write YA sci-fi. I also write adult sci-fi, but I think I love YA sci-fi because there's an accessibility and you can think of the big things, but you have to be a little bit more straightforward, and I can do that. But there are people who are doing it just so amazingly. And every time I read one of these, I'm like, what? And it takes me weeks, months to like grasp these big concepts, these big world building things that I didn't know that could happen within 300 or 400 pages. And, you know, I grew up reading Philip K. Dick. I read Octavia Butler. I've read a whole bunch of classics and all of these. And I always thought they were really amazing. But then you see how people are using those now to build from it and create like this new foundation. And they're doing it in such twisty or different ways. And it's always inspiring. And I love it. So I love everybody's examples. I'm just saying, wow, we are in a great time for sci-fi.
I think one of the interesting things you brought up there is just how much influence that sci-fi, takes from other sci-fi writers. I think that might even go a step further. Sci-fi really takes shape to a certain extent, even from other genres around it. And I think that as sci-fi writers, we may not always recognize we're doing that, but it's something we're very much influenced by. Like, I think it was AP brought up earlier on, like, one of the just overwhelming influences in the sci-fi world over the past 50 years has been Star Wars. And if you think about it, yes, it has been an incredibly influential science fiction franchise. It's also a space Western. This coming out of an era in film where the highest grossing films were those of John Wayne, of spaghetti Westerns with Clint Eastwood and whatnot, that Star Wars, being a sci-fi film, yes, it was very much that, but it also tended to lean on a lot of the tropes that made Westerns profitable, made them accessible to folks. And I think that just from a science fiction standpoint, that accessibility can really draw people in, just at a very basic level. I think that's part of why things like X-Men, like the MCU, whatever it may be, have grown over time to be as successful as they have. Because, on one hand, you have folks like you, Alechia, who've been reading X-Men since they were children, and you're seeing those same folks grow up to be the ones writing these movies, writing these books based off of them. But not only that, it really helps kind of create this casual audience who they are coming for. They're coming for the romance within a story. They're coming for the comedy within a story. Like, if you look at it in a very literal sense, I don't think most people would identify the film Idiocracy as science fiction. It is very much societal commentary, but traditionally it's not science fiction. But then you look at kind of how science fiction has shifted post the release of that film in the way it frames societal commentary, that I would argue it's an early forerunner of it, even if it literally itself is not. And yes, I recognize that real world circumstances also drive that, but it's interesting to see how much genre hopping science fiction does. And I think that that's part of what makes it as ubiquitous as it is. Be that, folks who have been around for, years, your Philip K. Dick, Ursula Le Guin's, or be it, like one of my favorite science fiction things ever was the film Ex Machina. And granted, that's partly because I write, my science fiction tends to be more focused on androids and artificial intelligence rather than aliens, because I've seen Dr. Horrible sing along blog, you don't build a ray gun. That's just not what you do. But by the same token, like, I think why sci-fi is incredible and why it can be both gratifying and challenging to write is because it has its fingers everywhere, whether we as authors within the genre realize it or not as we're writing it.
It's a little scary too, right? It's a little scary in that you have, well, you mentioned Idiocracy, which I consider it to be a backwards documentary these days. And it's a very scary thought to think that there's a bunch of sci-fi books out there that could very easily be moved into the nonfiction department.
Yeah,
I mean,
let's try not to get Terminator there, you know? Like,
well, I mean, forget about getting Terminated. I'm talking about, right, so we've mentioned Octavia Butler 3 times already. The Parable of the Sower. Forest fires in California, right. That reminds me of the news. And racial tensions. But who ever thought about that?
It's really hard to write dystopia right now because the news is always crazier.
Yeah.
I will say I got burned out on dystopia. I was very into dystopian novels when I was younger. And as I got older, I got burned out on them. And now that I'm a parent, I definitely am burned out on them. Because I'm like writing about the future and I'm thinking about the things that Evan pointed out, right? I'm thinking about like, you know, I have an 8-month-old and I'm thinking like, what kind of world is he gonna have? And what kind of worlds do I want to think about that? And I say that, you know, and there's an irony, and I say that because I also write a lot of horror, like science fictional horror, right? Like, you know, sometimes I write things and I don't even realize that they're science fiction. My case in point, my most recent story was about a brain-eating amoeba, a sentient brain-eating amoeba. I thought it was a horror story. Apparently, it's a science fiction story. Everybody thought it was a science fiction story. But my goal was to say something about what it means to be human through that, right? This amoeba is sort of like trying to comb through these human concepts of like love and hunger. It knows, but love. What's love? What's pain? What's loss? What's grief? And so, as others have pointed out, I think the great sci-fi is speaking to like what does it mean to be a person? Like, what is it going to be like to be a person? You know, what are the possibilities of personhood that will exist in the future that don't exist now? And that's sort of the space that I try to inhabit when I'm thinking about sci-fi, when I think about my kid. Because you know, I think about the world that we have now, right? We think about like all of the changes that have happened that would have been unimaginable. And that's not to get too hope punky on it. But I just think that for me, sometimes sci-fi is this sort of like way of thinking past the problems of right now. And I think that a lot of people look to sci-fi for that, for thinking about, again, you know, not only what does it mean to be a person, but like, what will it mean to be a person for future generations? And I think that's a point that AP has kind of already made, and you know, her reference to Ursula Le Guin and the sort of meeting of these future humans and these past humans, right? Sort of the staging of that very question.
There's this essay by Salman Rushdie that kind of keeps playing on my head very quite often these days, which is literature essentially is an angle to approach reality, a different angle to approach reality. And he was referring to it in terms of, in reference to politicized literature, weaponized literature, literature that tries to be a little bit dangerous, be a little bit subversive, ruffle a few feathers. It's probably going to be much easier to do that through sci-fi, mainly because you can take your metaphor and then just hide it in plain sight in a much easier fashion than you would with litfic, for example. I mean, with litfic, it's probably going to be a little bit obvious where you're heading, but with sci-fi, you can bury your message underneath layers and layers of metaphor, and those who know will know.
Yeah,
which is a very interesting concept.
I think that's absolutely true. I love.
You know,
what
I think
saying.
speaking to that, just I think one of the helpful things for genre fiction that you have that's useful over lit fic is tropes, right? You know, and you can use tropes to your advantage. You can subvert the tropes that are problematic, right? There are a lot of problematic tropes, and there are a lot of really great novels that are doing work to subvert those tropes. I can't think of an example right now, but I'm sure that one of these lovely writers will offer one.
Well, that's great. One of my questions was about tropes, but I actually want to play off what you had said previously, Jonathan. In kind of talking about it, I feel the same way as a parent. I have a 9-year-old and a 2-year-old, and like I want to think that we may be able to give our children at least a habitable planet, right? So I feel like I think you were kind of, and we've sort of talked about this a little bit, how the stories we tell are a reflection of the times that we live in, right? And dystopian was extremely popular and is maybe getting a little less popular. This is a trend I see in AP. I'm interested in what you see, but it seems like certainly cozy fantasy is having a little bit of a moment, right? And I think, like, I would argue again, the Becky Chambers Long Way story, that I would call that kind of cozy sci-fi. So I think there's an appetite now. I mean, I know this is sort of maybe marketing a little, kind of writing to an audience, but I think it's interesting that authors are Travis Baldree, that wrote Legends and Lattes, which is kind of the poster child for this cozy fantasy. He is an audiobook narrator, and he reads and narrates tons of kind of high stakes fantasy, and he's like, I wanted something low stakes. I wanted something that was just kind of more chill. So his main character is an orc woman that puts down the sword and opens a coffee shop, So, and I think there's such an appetite for that in our times. And I'm interested to hear, AP, like, what do you think of kind of trends that you're seeing? Maybe you also want to build off Jonathan's more recent point about tropes. What tropes do you like? What tropes do you think are pitfalls and you hate,
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think cozy as a subgenre is definitely having a moment, not only in fantasy but also in science fiction. Excuse me. And I think y'all are right. Jonathan mentioned, and Nicholas, you too. Like, I think I am also getting burned out on dystopia. I don't have kids, but like I personally would. I find it more productive for myself to imagine a world where we can be better as people, and where we can be better for future generations. And so I really think that those kinds of stories are really big right now. I've also read Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I think that's a fantastic book, and it definitely fits into the cozy as well. A Light from Uncommon Stars is another one that I've read recently. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. But that was also definitely fits into a cozy genre. And it's not that there aren't stakes in those kinds of like cozy stories, just that it's smaller. The scale of it is smaller. And so like the characters do face hardship, and they do face interpersonal conflict and things like that. But it's not on a world-ending space opera, society collapsing type of scale. And I think that people are really resonating with that right now. So.
Please.
As someone who just wrote a space opera, life-ending, society collapsing thing, which is A Song of Salvation, and has just sold a cozy fantasy, I have to say, I think I'm really happy that there's a lot of different things that are trending right now, and cozy is lovely. With my first two sci-fi, there's a cozy element to both of them, because maybe it's an incapability, but I love dystopian and I love all of these things, but I find that they can really detract from hope. And I love to write hopeful books. So if there's an element in dystopia in the Sound of Stars, but it's not really about that. So it's there, but it's in the background. And that's where I like to keep those things. I think if you're writing specifically, I've been writing for, marginalized Black youth. My thought process is not going to be like, let's give you some more pain. It's going to be, let's give you a lot to hope for. And yes, things are bad, but there's a way through it. And that's been the what I've been enjoying. And I really appreciate it that cozy fantasy and these cozy things are doing so well. And you look at, you know, what's playing right now on Apple, and Ted Lasso's doing well. And these things are all very gentle, calm. They're thinking about mental health. They're thinking about how people are taking care of themselves. And that is also another form of, you know, evaluating humanity and how do we survive? How do we make ourselves better? And that is how. So I love all of this. And I think that the trends are going to change again. Is I think what we've always seen, right, is that when things are really good, we write terrible things. And when things are pretty terrible, we go, we got to make good things. And right now we're in the we need the good things phase. So I think there's always a place for the terrible and the sad, and maybe the things that lack hope. But I think right now we need more hope than not.
I, for one, completely agree. But Evan, I don't know, like it seems like you're kind of a dystopian stan, you know? Like you want to push back on some, or
Oh, I don't want to push back in the sense that I disagree. I mean, I write dystopia mainly because that comes naturally. But even when I'm writing dystopias, right? So my debut novel, which came out last year, The Husk, it's supposed to be in a sort of post-apocalyptic environment, but it doesn't deal with that. It deals with very, very small stories. It deals with a small story. It deals with a single relationship. So in that sense, the dystopia is window dressing. It's meant to be providing a certain vibe and a certain feeling about it. And frankly speaking, I've read The Road. I don't think that anybody can do dystopia better than that, so I'm not even going to try. And you know, you're probably thinking The Road, having children, that's going to be a very, very difficult read, and it is for a lot of people. I honestly think that we're getting into a point where all of us are just filled with anxiety because of the news, because of climate change, because of war, because of social injustice, because of financial collapse. Because
you can keep going. You could, I mean, yeah.
nothing we do makes any difference. This is, in the end of the day, this is the worst thing, man. We can keep talking about it, but not really getting anywhere. We just keep pointing at negative things. So does it make sense that we go the other way, to the other extreme, and start talking about positivity and hope? Because there is this big thing that happens to the brain when you start thinking good thoughts, right? I mean, obviously not everything is flowers and rainbows, but if you think about the solution to a problem as opposed to thinking about the problem itself, you will find the solution to the problem. So I don't think I have the answer to that, again, because I don't write happy stories. I don't think I could if I tried. But I do think that we need to be writing collectively better, well, more positive stories. We need to be writing more hopeful stories potentially. And I've been a little bit quiet on this segment, mainly because I'm approaching sci-fi very much from a polemic, combative point of view, right? I mean, we are going to be talking about racial tensions. We are going to be talking about injustice, and we are going to be talking about financial and ecosystem collapses. Maybe we should be easing it up a little bit. Maybe we should be talking about how we're going to get out of the situation. I honestly don't know, but I mean, it might be a brave thing to do.
I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I think that dystopian sci-fi is bad or that there's anything wrong with it. I do think that it serves a very important function, and that it has since.
I hope it's not. Otherwise, I'm screwed.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think again that was more of a personal experience and relationship to it than anything. The only way I could have gotten burned out on it was because I consumed so much of it, right? I love the novel The Road. I'm not sure how it would read now. I do find that things that I previously have consumed hit differently now. I love the game Fallout. So, I love dystopian fiction, and I do think that it is important. But I do think that Alechia's point, that we write good stuff when things are bad, I do agree with that tends to be the case. But I do think that there's a reason that hope punk has become a lot more popular, or even things that are, one of my favorite sci-fi writers, contemporary sci-fi writers, is Kim Stanley Robinson. He's a colleague of my mentor, and he calls his writing optopian. So it's neither utopian nor dystopian. He calls it optopian, which is kind of like, he calls it like the best of what it's going to be, right? That there's going to be a lot of horrible stuff that's going to happen, and a lot of people are going to die. There's going to be famine, there's going to be disease, there's going to be ecological and systemic collapse, as you've said, Evan. But his novels are also about what's on the other side of that, right? Like focusing, as you said, on the solution and not on the problem, and what the world can look like if we do that, and what the world will look like on the other side of this thing that we're looking at right now, and focusing just on the problem and not sort of how to surmount it. And so I think that he's one of the writers that I look to a lot to think about, like, it's a way to believably like inject conflict into a story that I'm writing about, right? Because there's so much of it in the world to draw from, but also to use that as a springboard to go somewhere meaningful. Because I do think that there is value in talking about all of the awful experiences that we have as people, right? They're just as meaningful as the happy experiences that we have, even though we tend to shun them and don't like them, right? They do inform what it means to be, again, as we were speaking about earlier, what it means to be human, what it means to be a person.
Well, it just seems like it is becoming more and more an act of bravery to be optimistic.
I don't disagree with that.
To your point, though, I think one of the things that both dystopia and I like the term hope punk. I'm going to start using that. I think one of the things those two, genres do well, granted at completely different ends of the spectrum, is they personalize the story in a certain way. Science fiction, as folks on this panel, myself included, have talked about, they tend to deal with these very nebulous, big, heavy concepts. And I think that in and of itself is kind of the nature of sci-fi. It is a grand genre in its own sense. But I think why we saw, just from a literary standpoint, the boom in dystopia wasn't just the environment it was coming out of. It wasn't just, Cold War, World War II settings that drove that. It was also because of the personalization, the creating the feeling of the individual that experienced those feelings and it felt through them. I think that the hope punk idea definitely goes the same route in the other direction. And I think that that's part of the power of sci-fi is regardless of which end of the spectrum you're writing on, if you are, or even if you're not writing on an extreme, where science fiction gains a lot of the value is to make people feel involved in a grander scheme of things, whether that be, writing in a post-apocalyptic world and you're focusing on a specific family, whether it's a couple that is just trying to live their world in a world where one of the two of them is oppressed, whether it be, a grandma living in a cottage with knitting needles and she gains superpowers, whatever it is. I think that the real power of sci-fi is not just its societal commentary, but the relevance it creates within it.
So that is an interesting segue to my last big question, which is what would you like to see in the future of sci-fi? And I got to tell you, Tim, now I really want a story of a grandma knitting getting superpowers. I want to know how that works out. That's what I
Well,
want.
I have a book for you. It's not
Tell
mine.
me more. Tell me more.
It's
All
not
right.
mine. I know of
But-
a book where this happens.
That's amazing. Well, AP, let's start with you. What would you like to see in the future for sci-fi?
Oh man. Well, we talked about genre blending earlier. I really like a good blended genre. So I think personally, I would love to see just way more crossovers between sci-fi and other genres, and just like people expressing their creativity, and like, how can I put together a really unique story with elements of sci-fi and a western, or elements of sci-fi and horror. How can I make that something new? I think that's kind of, yeah, those are kind of like that, but also like, stories that really get into the meat of character, and like what drives your characters. Those two things I think for me are kind of the top, like what I would really like to see.
I love that. I agree. I like the major. You mentioned, Tim, that like Star Wars had some like Western vibes. Does anyone else get strong Western vibes from The Mandalorian? Like,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
Oh, most definitely.
I mean,
Right,
even
right.
even the theme song is a
True.
it's a
true.
Western theme
I mean,
song.
it's got Lone Wolf and Cub vibes that
Yeah.
draw Western back to a lot of like traditional, like Japanese films and stuff. Japanese manga.
Good stuff. All right, Tim, what would you like to see in the future of sci-fi?
I'm going to echo AP largely because it would allow my books to succeed in, say, genre blending. Like I didn't grow up being sci-fi reader writer. Like what I wanted to see, I wanted to watch Mel Brooks and Monty Python, and like I was comedy the whole way, other than the fact that The Truman Show was my favorite movie ever as a kid because I was weird. But like, I want more genre blending. Specifically, I want sci-fi that's not afraid to be funny while making a point. Like, Evan brought up, how the news is dark and whatnot, and it absolutely is. But I think that that's part of what has caused us to see things like The Daily Show last week, tonight, Colbert Report, when it was on, gain the popularity it has, because it is not just telling, the things that need to be told, but also doing it in a way that is consumable, it is funny, that is witty, that is satirical. I want to see more of that in sci-fi, and I'm doing my damnedest to do it, but I recognize that there are many better writers than me who will do it in ways that I would never have thought of. So everyone just slip in Monty Python jokes. It'll be good.
Love it. Yeah. But man, you're speaking my language. My work in progress is like a cozy, sort of hopefully funny sci-fi called How to Pee in Zero G. And like trying to, wrap in, some commentary, but some humor. Like we'll see how it goes. It's a long way from being something that you find folks could read. But, anyway, Alechia, what would you like to see in the future of sci-fi?
I'm just basically going to echo everything. There's going to be a lot more. I think there has to be more genre blending. I think because sci-fi is having some ups and downs with how it's being bought, it's being repackaged into, more fantasy. And I've noticed that a lot of fantasy authors are kind of using sci-fi in little sneaky ways. And I think that's great. So I think it would be cool to see more of that. And I also would love to see more exclusion, like marginalized authors get their chances at telling stories that they haven't before. I would love to see more transgender, more Black always, of course, and everyone. I just want everyone to be able to get in and break into this industry, because it's really, really complicated. And sci-fi especially is so hard to break into. I mean, for me, I love YA, and I love writing for teens and youth. But It's really complicated. It's really, you are putting yourself out there and you're going to get a lot of passes and rejections. So I wish it was a lot more open. I would love to see more disability rep as well in science fiction. I think we are not nearly at capacity, and we can definitely have way more stories. I just want everyone who has felt exclusion in this genre, in this, you know, in this industry to have more open doors and get in. So that's where I would love it to be. And we can see that now, you know, just looking at media of who gets to be in sci-fi stories. You know, you had like, if you were watching The Mandalorian, you had like Lizzo up here and there, you had people up here and there, and it's like, okay, we can do stuff like this. You know, we can have more body diversity. We can have all kinds of people in these stories. Why aren't we letting those kind of people tell these stories? So that's what I would love to see. I think the industry has a long way to go still, but I think every time we publish, we're kind of pushing the envelope a little bit more. And I'm hoping that we're just going to knock it off and everybody's going to get in. That's what I hope. That's not really a great analogy, but you know what I mean.
No, yeah, I definitely understand. I appreciate that. I think you're absolutely right. Dr. Jonathan Kincade, what do you think? What do we need in the future?
We've had some really great answers so far. I want to echo a lot of those. I love genre bending. I love weird things that are set in space that you wouldn't expect to be set in space. That's always a favorite. One of the novels like that I'm thinking of is Gideon the Ninth, which does a lot of blending of fantasy and sci-fi tropes. It's super badass, super cool. I also want to see, I think, more global sci-fi. A lot of the sci-fi that we are exposed to here in the US, a lot of people don't realize is a fraction of the sci-fi that exists in the world. I remember being in undergrad and like taking a class and talking to my professor, and she's like, it doesn't make sense that a UFO would land in New York or LA, right? Like, look at the continents on the world, like, just statistically speaking, right? It doesn't make sense. And I was like, that's true. And I started reading a lot of African sci-fi after that. A lot of, District 9 was a really awesome film for me that got me thinking about that too. And so I want to see more sci-fi that, in translation maybe, right? Or just sci-fi that takes place elsewhere in the world. And that's not to say that it doesn't exist, but I just want it to be more on the forefront of people's experience of sci-fi. And so sort of higher profile in the future is, I think, what I'd say.
Love it. Yeah. Yeah. I think that, yeah, definitely a good point. Not everything happens in our backyard, right? Evan, you're the not American on the panel, so I think you definitely agree with that sentiment. But what else? What would you like to see kind of in the future?
Oh, let me just say that I got some great Finnish sci-fi that I want to send Jonathan's direction. You're gonna love that. As far as what I would like to see, this might be a bit of a big ask, but I would honestly hope that sci-fi helps to pave the way for certain ideas that will lead to burning down some traditional structures. And I know this sounds very rah-rah, leftist, socialist, let's destroy the system. I mean, it's never as simple as that. It's never as simple as that. And anybody has crossed their 30s can understand just how complicated things are. But the truth of the matter is that there are a lot of traditional structures that are hurting us. They're hurting us as humans. They're hurting our mental health. They're hurting our our ability to survive in the future. A lot of science fiction that I personally grew up loving dealt with issues that were very taboo for the time. And they were very reflective of people's ideas about how we should be moving forward as a species. I can't really picture it right now, or maybe I'm just grasping at the periphery of it. There's a huge discourse about how we need to do better as a species. We need to do better. We need to do better in our relationships. We need to do better in our working lives. We need to do better towards the environment, towards other species that we share this planet with. Like I said, pretty big ask, but if I ever come across a genie, I'm probably going to use one of my wishes for that.
I think it's good, man. I think you're right. It has to start with an idea, right? Has to, and it can propagate. That idea could propagate in a story. Again, I think that's kind of bringing it all the way back. That's the magic of sci-fi, is it can sort of imagine the future, and that future hopefully is one that's less destructive to ourselves and to our planet and to the other species we share this planet with. And man, from your lips, like.
Yep. Hopefully there's going to be some sort of idea that will propagate like a virus in word form and just make us better.
Yes.
There's a book about that,
Oh yeah.
What an excellent conversation. I would be happy to sit here with you fine folks for another 2 hours. This has been sort of fun. I've been so grateful to be here for it. I hope everyone that gets to watch this has enjoyed it too. But I'd love for anyone who's watching this and thinking, man, these guys are genius, to be able to follow you. So AP, how can people follow you online? How can they get in touch?
Yeah, so my my website is aphawkinsauthor.com. You can also find me on social media. My handle on Twitter and Instagram is ahawkwrites. So yeah, but yeah, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for, running this conversation for us, and thank you to everyone else, for being here. It was great talking with y'all.
Thank you. Tim, how can people find you?
I'm not as good at consistent branding as AP is, in that I have different usernames across different sites. I am another indie writer on both Instagram and Mastodon. On Twitter, I am T. Baughman Author. And then I have a editing business that I have both on Ko-fi, and then no logo. It's in the, I can vandal my screen. Job at Place LLC. I do developmental editing and story direction design for various folks. So
Love it. Alechia, how can people find you?
So you can find me on my website, which is alechiadow.com. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram as at Alechia Dow. It's a weird spelling, so you might have to look that up. But yeah, you can find me everywhere. I'm all over the place.
And Tim Baughman, Alechia Dow, if you're watching the video, and hopefully you are, you'll see their names right there. Jonathan, where can we find you?
You can find me on my website at jkincade.com and on Twitter at -times.
-time. All right. And Evan, where can we find you online?
All right. So my website is EA Mylonas, no spaces. From there onwards, you can find my handles for Instagram, where I post a lot of pictures of pretty trees. You can find my Twitter handle, where I'm mostly just complaining about the state of the world. And that's pretty much it. And thank you for moderating this this wonderful panel. And it's been truly a pleasure talking with the wonderful humans.
No, thank you. Thank all of you. If you'd like to follow me, you can check me out at youtube.com/@NicholasWFuller or my website, nicholaswfuller.com. Like I mentioned, I'm a writer and a gamer, and I like to kind of talk about the intersection of the two on my YouTube. I'm also working on my own cozy sci-fi, and I'm definitely going to be trying to incorporate some of what I've learned today into my own writing. Thank each of you panelists. This has been wonderful. I've had a blast. I'm glad that we were able to get our schedules together to do this. Even I was worried about Evan being across the world, but that ended up not being a problem. It was great. Thanks to Right Hive staff for putting this all together, putting this panel on, the whole conference, letting us all be a part of this, making my job really easy. And thank you for watching. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.